All right. So how's everybody doing?
Good.
Thanks for coming. So Bryce asked me to speak here today, and topic of discussion is Webflow of Visual CMS. And we'll start with what is a CMS. CMS stands for Content Management System, and content management systems are used to organize thoughts, ideas, and content into structured universal formats. So your video, your audio, your websites, your images, anything you need. All right. Does anybody know what the first CMS was? Was books. People had ideas and they wanted to be able to write them down and share them with other people. So they had to have a way to do that, and that was by using the written language and organizing it into chapters with text, images, and numbers. So those were kind of your first forms of data that were ever input into a content management system. Pretty simple, 3 things: text, images, and numbers, and that's where it all kind of kicked off. Over time, you would see these old like cuneiform tablets that are like, just like kind of like one standard font size and like no variation. So those things were kind of hard to decipher. So people started to come up with ways to add some visual identification to those systems. So they started adding things like chapters, headings, subheadings, paragraphs, italics, bullet points, footnotes, glossaries, so that you could easily scan through your books to identify what you were looking for. Super handy. Now, then came along a guy named Gutenberg and his printing press, and this would be considered like the global hosting infrastructure of its time. So this is your hosting plan. People had books, they had to get them out there into the world, and suddenly there was much more content to manage. So you've got books that are content, and then you've got a collection of books, which are more content. So books are spreading everywhere. People are, reading left and right, and there's just an explosion in knowledge growth, right? So all these books are getting produced, and then you got to put these books somewhere. So you put them in a library. And a library was the internet of its day, and as we discussed earlier, it's kind of interesting how quickly things can go from numero uno to like, what's a library? I haven't been in one of those for a while. But libraries were like the internet of their day. They contained a lot of content that was highly valuable, and a lot of times, like in wars, the first things that they did were burn the books, because that was the value to those civilizations, was their knowledge. So how was that content managed and categorized? Was in things called card catalogs. So this was essentially the search engine of the day. Everything was coded via the Dewey Decimal System. I don't know if you remember these things from school. I never really understood the code, which is why we're here, no code, right? I never could understand this thing. So the Dewey Decimal System was the language used to describe all of the content in this library, right? It was the SEO of its day. So fast forward a few hundred years, and you're into the digital and web content space, right? So humanity has kind of like done its thing, figured out some technology, started building things, and then have kind of come up with ways to start transferring signals over wires and things of that nature that allowed for the first analog computers. So analog computers were born to assist humans in solving complex or tedious problems and handle large volumes of information that you just couldn't do. Now, once those systems began to mature a little bit, people started to write languages and code to organize the content, manage it, in structured ways where there were different types of fields that became standardized. So That's things like originally in books, you had your text, images, and numbers. And once you get into the digital and web space, you end up with things like text, images, numbers, true or false, date, time, links, and files. This is due to the ability to have logic and relation in the digital space versus books. So having things do things based on various types of information. So through advancements in transistor technology and the invention of silicon microchips, those computers grew smaller and more accessible, and people became connected over the internet, which began to spread digital content at a pace that Gutenberg and his friends could only imagine. The internet was the new library, except this library started out sort of empty. There wasn't much there, right? It was a few nerds and some labs that, oh man, I made these computers talk, and like there were maybe a couple of websites, and they were, pretty bad. Wow. This was the first McDonald's website. It's the official McDonald's website. They had to put official on there.
How would you know?
Or how else would you know? Maybe I'm on mick.donalds.com. This was the first Apple website. And people started to take advantage of a database content software to organize and spread information digitally, so on websites. Standard formats began to emerge to help identify key content visually. A much easier way to scan for greater efficiency, similar to books that had chapters, headings, subheadings, and paragraphs. Websites had H1, H2, H3, etc., paragraphs, italics, bold, links, etc. Domains were created to give these sites a location in the modern day library. They provided a way for users to view someone else's content, and it was kind of the modern day Dewey Decimal System. How are we going to find these websites? Where are they? Where do they live? Right. Pretty soon thereafter, software emerged that could automatically locate and register domains, read standard formatting to determine the relevance of the information, and index it so that you could then search it in a browser. So basically what Google is doing is it's going through and it's reading your structured content. It's determining what it thinks you've told it is important or not important, so that when we're looking through our library, the internet, we can find what we're looking for very, very easily. And now Google, that's how Google makes all their money. So creating web content. The dot-com boom started to hit when you were able to start making these websites and get them posted online, and there was kind of a mad dash, mad race. Everybody was making content, putting things up, and it was kind of the first real delve into the web content space. The problem was that writing these databases and launching a website was very, very slow and complex to set up, hard to maintain, and expensive. These sites were all like hand-coded. The content databases needed code to be rewritten by each person who wanted to create a website. So you've made one website, Bryce is going to make another website, he's got to write the same code, and it's just a lot of man hours going to writing the same code over and over and over. As we'll see later, not necessary. Fortunately, over time, things like CSS or cascading style sheets began to get more advanced, so that websites started to look better visually, and they started to become better ways of conveying information once you add that visual element. So fast forward a little bit from there, and tools like WordPress began to come out, which allowed people to more easily create and manage databases and apply styles. It was really great, and it still is really great for relational content and content management systems. clearly, it's a ubiquitous technology even today. A lot of stuff is built on WordPress. But that being said, there are some drawbacks, which are there's a lot of hand coding involved. It can become very slow. Some of the infrastructure issues. Styling isn't super powerful in WordPress either. So when you're building in these site builders like WordPress, you're not actually able to see in real time what you're building, which is a visual, kind of a barrier and one of the main differentiators of some of the more modern technologies where you're coding without knowing that you're coding. Trying to avoid using that no code term. Visual engineering. So when you're building in these builders, there's a lot of hand coding. It can be confusing for people who don't know code. It's kind of hard to communicate with the non-coder as well. Nevertheless, more complex CMS structures began to evolve, where you're able to really manage a lot of the complexity of multi-page sites and reusable templates and those kind of things. Content was becoming very dynamic. Sites were starting to look better visually. But there was still a lot of room for advancement, especially in the areas of speed and complexity. So, I think this is why we're all here. Content management goes visual. So these are kind of the big questions with the existing tools. Like, how can you make content management more intuitive? How do you make content management systems faster to develop? Could you make the CMS more useful during the design process? And why would you want to change the way it works currently? The first step into the visual CMS space was with tools like Squarespace and Wix, as far as ubiquitous kind of platforms that everyone was using. So WYSIWYGs, or what you see is what you get, platforms such as Squarespace began to gain popularity. They began to become solutions for a lot of these big questions that we're asking about. Wow, why would we want to use a visual CMS? These tools are easy to use and understand. They're quick to work with. They're visually appealing. They're very cost effective, and they're really efficient if you're trying to do work quickly. So these pre-constructed UI elements are kind of combined to create more simplistic sites that have a nice visual element to them without coding. Kind of headed in the right direction a little bit, right? So the cons. They're limited in their visual customization, limited in content database customization options, and they're not necessarily useful in an enterprise environment. If you've ever worked with enterprise customers that have tried to use Squarespace, they're my number one customers because they can't use Squarespace. It just doesn't work, right? It's limited in functionality as far as some of the more advanced type of integrations that you might want to do, maybe payment processing, like what are some like custom embed type stuff where you're doing like dynamic embeds, which we'll talk about a little later. But nonetheless, they were going kind of in the right direction with this stuff. So what you really need to take this to the next level is you need something that's enterprise grade. It needs to be more or less infinitely customizable because it's really quick. You arrive very quickly at the question of like, can it do this? And if the answer is no, like you might as well not even be there. So having as many options as possible. It needs to be very efficient. It needs to be forward thinking and easy to use. So I would say enter Webflow. It's an easy to understand enterprise level tool. Content management meets visual design. Now, what does that mean? A visual content management system, create the content structures you need in Webflow CMS, design your layout, then bind your elements to your site's content. So really what you're doing is a lot of these complex coding things that were happening over the years to build websites. required manual typing, etc. And you're getting into a visual design and development system where your content is being built in a visual environment. So you have things like text fields, image fields, links, videos, email fields, phone number fields, number fields, all these types of data that you can start to put into a visual CMS environment. You can use that data to dynamically create embeds. We use this a lot for Eventbrite as one of our main clients. So they have an embed that has a unique identifier, which is called their event ID. So the code is always the same for every event except for that event ID. So in our content management system, we have a field called event ID, which is just a text field because it's just numbers and letters. And it dynamically changes in the CMS based on that text. You can reference other types of content, which is actually one of the more powerful uses of content management. Is when you're developing content structures, you come across things on a site that get reused in various different places, and to avoid having like multiple versions of the same piece of data, you're able to reuse it throughout the site in all kinds of ways. And when you get into these visual environments, it gets very, very creative very quickly what you can do, because normally this type of stuff was originally designed for kind of more static type of content, or more like blog style type of stuff. But you can get into things like one of the sites that we built for Marvel. We actually took each one of the Marvel characters and put them into a CMS collection called characters, and added an image field, and then we were able to, like, on page load, it was going to like randomly load a character and their theme to that page, right? So you're able to kind of like reuse those throughout in various ways. Like we also used it in like the mobile drop down menu. So when it dropped down, there was like a Marvel hero image, which is pretty cool. So this is kind of a example of some of that stuff in use, where you're pulling dynamic data from the CMS into a design in real time. So what you end up with is, instead of looking at code and kind of trying to guess, like, I think it's probably going to look like this, or I think it's probably going to look like that, you are able to see it as you're building it, so you can get a better idea of what's really going on, which is fantastic. So this is a good segue. So static versus dynamic content.
So many of our projects are all about content, and sometimes we have a lot of it. Back in the Stone Age, we'd have to configure all this by hand. That's what we mean by static content. It stays just as we created it. We'd get this perfectly designed blog page exactly how we'd like it, and what do? We duplicate, and then we go in and change the content on our duplicated page. We just created another blog post. But then what happens when we want to change part of our design? We want to add something new on each page. Well, that's fine. We just go back and change it on the other page too. Except that's not how it works, because this project has 400 blog post pages. We've all been here. That's static content. We have to do everything by hand. With dynamic content, the concept changes entirely. Dynamic content, whether it's a name or a color or a photo or a number or an email address, any content, it can be added or imported whenever to a database. And your design, no matter how perfect it is, or how detailed you make it, or how many pages you have, you just create it once. And you can pull anything from that database. So everything gets built out automatically. No more going back and updating everything one by one. This works for anything you can imagine, because you can customize the database to have any kind of content you want. With that, you can do blogs and restaurant menus and development projects and team member pages and news sites and fake news sites. But that's the main difference. Static content, entering and tweaking things one by one, and dynamic content. You can reference your custom database, you get to control everything, but the content is built out automatically using your design.
So, dynamic content. That's right out of the horse's mouth. That's the main guy at Webflow that does their videos. He's pretty funny if you have watched any of those. But pretty powerful stuff, which you're able to start doing when you get into the dynamic content space. So, for instance, that Marvel site that I was talking about before that we did for Eventbrite actually had 8,000 individual events in it, which seems crazy, but really you're just building one template and you've got 8,000 pieces of data that are being synced from somewhere else, and then it just kind of like does its thing, right? If you had to do each one by hand, like you just, people ask me that all the time. Like, did you have to put all those in by hand? I'm like, yeah, I did. No. You just keep thinking that. But no, there's so many advantages to using dynamic content. So the Webflow CMS in particular is very, very powerful in the ability to have flexibility and to have speed when you're creating, especially today when you're working with clients. Everybody's last minute. Everybody has a raising bar of expectation of what they want something to look like, the functionality. Like, they're like, oh, well, Apple's website does it. Why doesn't our website do it? Like, oh, well, you guys have $1 trillion? Because if you do, like, let's talk. But, you know, being able to change on the fly is something that is very, very powerful about Webflow as well, where a lot of times, and it's great as part of the creative process in general, a lot of times you're working on something and things change, and that change is a good thing a lot of times, where you're like, oh, well, this was a good idea, but this is a better idea, so let's add this and let's add this. And instead of having to like, okay, engineer guy, like go add us another field for this and go add us another date field, like you can just go in and start building visually.
The CMS is how we control and work with our dynamic content. In the Webflow CMS, the data structure is very straightforward and will build from the bottom up. At the very bottom, we have our content fields. These fields let us capture or input content, whether we're doing this one by one or by importing a CSV with a ton of data. All that content is put in fields. Of course, we're usually dealing with multiple items, each of them made up of these fields, and those items are all grouped together into a collection. A collection is the top-level container for our content. So, if we have a collection of team members, each team member is an item. Each item, or team member, has fields of content. That's the structure of the Webflow CMS. Ready to use that collection in a project? Two ways to do that. We can use a collection list, which lets us drop in collection content anywhere. And of course, we have collection pages. Design one collection page, and your other collection items will follow suit. Collection pages are automatically created for each collection item. When you're using collection lists or collection pages, they can be designed in any way to fit your brand. You can change or add more content to your collection at any time. You can do this from the designer, or you can use the editor. The editor lets collaborators log in and access these collections, which makes it quick to add blog posts, employees, news, all of this plugging into the fields you created. Or collaborators can edit content right on the live website. Press publish from the editor, and that content is now live. Now, we've created detailed content for each aspect of the Webflow CMS, but here we've covered the basics. We have collections, which contain each item made up of fields. We can use any of the content from these collections in our project, whether it's the collection list element or collection pages. And we have the editor, a powerful way for site owners to add or change content and publish to bring that content live.
So as you can see, it's a pretty powerful way of doing things versus the traditional hand-coded method. It becomes extremely fast to build large volumes of content into a website and to do things visually that you just aren't able to do in a lot of other platforms. It's extremely powerful and user-friendly. I don't know, has anybody actually spent any time with Webflow, working with Webflow? Anybody?
Not yet.
I just kind of tried to create a project before I came, but I was like, hey, I need to watch
Well-
more videos.
I use
Well-
CMS. I use Joomla CMS.
Same concept.
Integratable. Can I import it into Webflow?
Yeah, you can, depending on the CMS that you're using, you should be able to export as like a CSV file and then import the CSV file. So it's pretty universal these days, and in almost any software space or infrastructure space now, they all kind of make it really easy to like get your stuff from that guy's platform and onto our platform. So like everybody, there's a pretty good way to move your data around if you really need to on these things usually, which is pretty nice. I mean, even a lot of the enterprise like infrastructure like AWS and Azure, like you can start to transfer your entire database over if you want to. So it's so much incentive for those companies to allow that type of stuff that it's very, very doable. Does anybody have any other questions about the CMS in particular?
Isn't Airtable, is that a big deal with working with Webflow? Because that's like a database talking to another database?
Yeah, I kind of get into that a little later on in here, but that's more of a, that might almost be more of a Bryce question, but the Airtable integrations are really a kind of an external third-party way into the Webflow CMS. So a lot of people use it for modifying data as it like travels between two things, I think.
Yeah.
So like something's coming from Gmail, from their API, and you have somebody, their name goes into the Airtable and then it gets passed on to Webflow. So it's kind of like a third-party database type scenario.
Yeah.
Actually did some work with Airtable recently. I did just enough to be like, oh, I know what this is, and kind of moved on, so I haven't spent a lot of time with it. But technically speaking, no. Like, I haven't used Airtable, and I'm, probably one of the power users of Webflow that's out there. So it is definitely something that can be used, though.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is like, especially in no code, a lot of times there are just like third-party ways to gather information, and you need to take it and like funnel it to different spots. And so a lot of no-code projects will have Airtable as a piece of that that might flow into their like publicly facing Webflow site, but certainly not like necessary per se.
Yeah, and I kind of get into that in the next part here. So that's a good segue.
There you go.
So the underlying process and more advanced Visual CMS uses. So Webflow allows you to quickly and easily add new fields to a collection of items. So I actually do a lot of this, and maybe it's partially because I'm like lazy and don't like to like, maybe it's I don't know what it is, but I'm constantly looking for correlations in pieces of data that my clients are giving me. So like, are there two things that are alike? And if there's a third one, we're making a collection. Like because it can really easily get out of hand where if you don't group things together and put them into the CMS, you end up with, oh, well, there were 3 and now there's 4. And you're like, it's getting a little tricky. And then somebody's like, oh, we need to add another one. And then there's 5, and then you're doing 5 things by hand. So looking for these correlations and then figuring out what the universal data is across those items is kind of the big key here, right? So if you're going like, oh, we need to add a user to this, like a speaker at a Meetup group, and it's going to be Bryce Vernon, so we're going to need a name, and we're going to need a date that he's speaking, and we're going to need an image, and we're going to need what city he's from, and then every speaker is also going to need those fields, right? So in Webflow, you're very, very easily able to set these things up and kind of expand on those. If we go like, oh, well, we want to also put our speaker's favorite color of whatever their favorite color, we're going to add a color field, and then we can have their box be red, right? So doing things like that. And then you're able to do things based on, and this is the big moneymaker on this stuff. So conditional visibility is the ability to do things based on various conditions in your CMS data. So if Bryce hasn't provided a color, we're going to go to the default color. Or if Bryce hasn't given us a location that he lives at, it's going to say only show location if location provided. So you're setting these types of logic based on the data that's provided. We use this a lot for things like, I use this a lot for like really complex things and making them very simple. So I have clients that ask for a lot of things like, oh, well, we've got a collection, but this one item in this collection doesn't really match up, so you've got to alter it somehow. Like, we've got blog posts and everything's text, but this blog post is about a video. So what do there? You make a video section, and then you go, if video link provided, then show video section, and hide text section. So you can start doing alterations on your design based on the information that's provided. And then if you actually do it in if you think about it a little bit and you do it in kind of an organized fashion, you can start to set up almost like mini dashboards for your clients where, if I have somebody that's asking for something more than once, chances are I'm going to build them a feature where I'll add a field, like I'll add an on-off field, right? Where they'll be able to go like show the city name, and they'll be able to hit a switch, and if they flip it off, it'll hide it, and if they turn it on, it'll put it away. So gives them a little bit of control as well. So it's really kind of the superpower of a lot of this stuff.
Despite the 9-syllable mouthful, conditional visibility is really straightforward, and it's a great way to show or hide entire elements and their children based upon an item's content inside a collection. Now, we all know that wasn't 9 syllables, it was 47. We meant conditional visibility. Here's a collection page, and here's a section element with content inside, and we love this section, but we only want this section to show up on certain pages. Let's go on over and create a condition. The element and its children is only visible when, and from the dropdown, we can make the selection. We're only showing this section when the work category is portraits. We don't want this section showing up to advertise portrait photography if the page is about shooting landscape architecture, residential interiors, commercial exteriors, or Doctor Who cosplay. But we do want it showing up if someone's reading about portraits. So by doing this, by setting up this condition, we've made it so that the section only appears on pages that have the portraits category set. We can see that the section won't show up if the category isn't set to portraits. When we hit another page that has its category set to portraits, the section displays perfectly. This doesn't just apply to pages. Here in this collection list containing team members, we want to add an email link. That's fine. Let's go over and drag in a text link. Let's double click to rename this Email Me so we can link this to each team member's email. But we actually have a problem. Some team members don't have emails listed. Wouldn't it be great if we could only show this element on team members who have emails set? We'll keep this text link selected and go over to do just that. Add a condition stating that the element is visible when an email is set. We only want to show this element if we set an email on that team member. And just like that, all the work was done for us. We didn't have to go manually hunting through every last team member. Now, Joan's the team leader here, and she doesn't want people emailing her directly because she's putting out fires all day and email is a distraction. And Dan still uses AOL, so we're not even listing that. So what can we do here? Well, we can drag in a static text link. This time, we can double click to edit and even change the text to contact our team, and then go over to set the link to send an email. This way, people can still click Contact Our Team instead of seeing blank space where the email should be. The reason we're demoing this is to show that we can create a condition here on this static element. It's just a text link pointing to an email. Let's go over and add a condition. This time, we'll make sure to show this text link when an email is not set. And that's it. We've used conditional visibility to control the visibility of these elements, or in the case of that section, an element and its children, based on the conditions we specified.
So pretty interesting what you can start to do with this stuff as far as showing and hiding various elements in your design. And it's interesting, since they made that video, they changed that a little bit. Now it automatically knows if nothing's provided, and it will hide automatically. So that's actually something I didn't notice, and I was like, this seems a little easier for some reason. Oh yeah, you don't have to go through the hide process on everything if not provided, basically. So there's a lot of really powerful stuff you can do when you start managing content this way and working in these kind of CMSs versus a traditional hand-coded process. It actually opens up the ability to create very complex things, and in a very universal way. Everybody is able to understand visual things. You can see it, you move it, like it's a tactile experience versus hand coding, where your brain has to do the math of like, I'm typing this and it's gonna do this, I think. So it's like, so there's like a lot of back and forth and like a lot of guesswork that's taken out as well. So that's where the efficiency part comes in. Added side bonus, you're not coding by hand. So what happens when you type by hand? Who has fat fingers? Typos. There's no typos that can break your code when a machine is writing the code for you. It's actually one of the hidden gems of the whole no code movement is like no typos. So this gets into what you were asking about Airtable. So APIs and connected CMS databases. Zapier, as Bryce can tell you, is one of the ubiquitous no-code API tools that you can use to connect CMSs together. So imagine your website's got a CMS, but every software service basically is just a CMS. And Bryce poignantly pointed this out last time I was here. Everything is literally just a list of some sort. It's content management in lists. So like Facebook is a list it's a feed of Bryce's stuff and Wilson's stuff and my stuff and whoever's stuff, right? And you've got these different fields, and if you want to get those fields from a Facebook and into your Webflow, they match up because why? They've used the universal language of content management systems, which are images and text, and it all just kind of lines up, right? So if you're taking an image from Facebook and moving it into Webflow, it's the same type of database, right? All you have to do is create some kind of a handshake in the middle, which is called OAuth, where I'm sure you've seen before when you go to a website and you go, do you authorize this account to access your information when you're like accessing two different things, right? So that's what authorizes the transference of data. And since it's technically like not like any type of secured data, usually it's customer or consumer facing or public facing data, like a profile image or whatever. Like there's very low risk of like moving things across. It's just like a convenience thing. So it's pretty much the ubiquitous form of data transfer now is over APIs, and it's pretty insane what you can do with that stuff when you get into these visual environments. This is an example of the Zapier user interface backend. I don't know if this is really current or not. I think they've done some updates, but thanks to old Google, like that's what I got. But I mean, the concept is the same. You've got an origination source of where the data is coming from, and then you're sending it somewhere else, and you're matching these fields. So you're going to go, all right, I want the email field from what is this an example of? Google Sheets. So you want to email field from the Google Sheets to go to the email field in your Webflow website. There you go. End of the day, you're moving stuff, you're making things happen. So, in conclusion, I think the future of all of this no-code visual CMS content management system stuff is extremely bright. It's kind of like the day one of this stuff as far as people really understanding the value. Very large companies, sometimes the largest companies in the world, are looking very heavily at these types of tools as ways to streamline what they're already doing to help with efficiency and help with communication amongst teams, and just like remove a lot of the barriers that exist to communicating between engineers and product developers. So the future is really bright for this stuff, and I personally look forward to the future of limitless combinations of tools at affordable prices, which is really what this stuff is. And I talk to Bryce and a lot of my clients about this all the time. The future of everything is going to be these verticals, right? Where there's companies like Zapier, and there's companies like QuickBooks, and there's companies like Gusto for HR, and there's companies like Webflow for websites that are very, very, very good at what they do. They do one thing and they do it, and they give you access to it for $40 a month, and they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars and have the top experts in the world, and you get to use that same thing for $40 a month. So if you leverage the power of APIs, you can start to leverage billions of dollars worth of research for hundreds of dollars a month, put it onto a platform like an AWS or an Azure global infrastructure. You're launching companies for literally hundreds of dollars that would have cost millions and just been unattainable in the past and the not too far past. Like a couple of years ago, like this just wasn't going to happen. So the ability to build in a limitless environment and to leverage the infrastructure that's been built and the technologies that have been built is just extremely exciting for me. And I pretty much look forward to doing this stuff for a long time to come.
Right.
Thanks.